South Asia offers a diverse and dynamic landscape of curatorial exploration. We hope that the discussions over the next few days will inspire new ideas and contribute meaningfully to the discourse on art practices in South Asia and beyond. Anant Foundation for the Arts is a nascent non-profit arts organization established 6 months ago, dedicated to support modern and contemporary South Asian arts practices by facilitating cultural and artistic exchange, trans-regional connections, and institutional collaborations. Our vision includes addressing existing gaps within the South Asian contemporary arts context through programs like this curatorial forum, as well as an award for artworks on paper that we launched last year in partnership with JK Paper. The JK Paper Award for the arts propositions in paper was the first of AFA's programs created with the intention of appreciating paper as an enduring medium of expression within the arts. The Anant Curatorial Forum intends to bring together the experiences and perspectives of practitioners engaged in some of the most dynamic, critical, and meaningful explorations in curation. The curatorial function has evolved to take on several forms within a changing global cultural landscape and has become increasingly relevant as a framework, not just within the arts, but across other disciplines. This edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum includes 6 panel discussions over the course of 2 days that will examine some of these pressing issues. I would like to express great pleasure in welcoming our speakers here today, luminaries in their fields, many of whom have flown in from different parts of India and neighboring countries. I also extend a special welcome to the audience here who have taken time out to come and participate in the symposium. And last but not least, I'm deeply grateful to Meera Menezes, her leadership of the Anant Foundation for the Arts. And personally, I'm really happy to have her at the helm of this. Hi, Miss Meera. Take on from here.
Thank you, Mamta, for your generosity and support in launching the first edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum. You immediately bought into the idea of the need for a platform to foster conversations around curatorial practice. Thank you to all our speakers who accepted our invitation to participate, and all of you in the room today who've taken the time and trouble to attend. I also want to call out a few of the curators here, I mean, not by name, but say thank you for your inputs in shaping this forum, because you came with ideas, you came with suggestions, and that was, that's really helped me to sort of shape this forum. I'm going to keep my opening remarks short in the interest of time. I personally have benefited greatly from such forums in the past, and I would like to pay tribute to some of them. We had dialogues on curating, which was held in this very building over a decade ago. It was conceptualized by the late Dr. Kavita Singh and Vidya Shivdas, who's going to be here today. Mayank Mansingh Paul was also here, and Heidi Fishner initiated Prague Forum, which brought together writers and curators across disciplines, including dance. Then there's the Experimenter Curators Hub, which has provided me personally the opportunity to learn from my peers. I hope we can do the same with the Anant Curatorial Forum. We've often talked about the etymology of the word curator, which, as we know, comes from the Latin curare, or to take care of. In the very conflict-ridden times we live in, the need for care is more imperative than ever. I hope that the forum provides a safe space for 2 days of discussion, debate, and even dissent. How might we, cultural producers, work across disciplines to reimagine new models for the future? Finally, I also hope that some of the things that emerge out of our 2 days of deliberations will inform our next edition of the Anant Curatorial Forum. Now for some housekeeping rules. Please put your mobile phones on silent, and if you do need to leave the room, for some reason, try and do it between presentations and not during one. As you can see, we're very packed here, and it will be difficult to sort of get out if you need to. But yeah, maybe between presentations, please use that. I also request all the presenters to stick to the time allocated to them as we're running on a very tight schedule. Okay, before I launch into the program, I wanted to let you know that Geeta Kapoor is down with flu and can unfortunately not be with us today. We're all very disappointed, but I will step in as the moderator for that panel. Now, just to run through the program today, the first panel is in conversation with institutional templates that will run from 10:15 to 11:45. We have a tea break from 11:45 to 12:15. Our second panel, History of the Curatorial Figure in India Pre-Globalization, will take place from 12:15 to 1:45. We have a lunch break from, I know it's a bit late, but can't be helped, from 1:45 to 3. And after lunch, we just have one session, which is the alternative framework of the artist curator from 3 to 4:30 p.m. So with that, I'm going to request the presenters of the first panel to come to the dais. We're waiting for Anushka. She's on her way. But in the meantime, I'm just going to read out the bios, the short bios. So quick introductions. Premjish Achari is going to be our moderator for this panel in conversation with institutional templates. Premjish is a curator and writer. His curations include the exhibitions Inscapes, In Search of a Place, which was at Bikaner House in 2023. Things Are Vanishing Before Us, Bikaner House in 2023 as well. The Students' Biennale for Kochi Biennale Edition 2022-23. All Canaries Bear Watching, part of the Indo-UK collaboration Grid Heritage Project at SAA JNU in 2022. Premjish was the editorial supervisor of Lokane Tharagaru. I hope I pronounced it correctly. The world is one. You'll have to correct me then. The World is One Family 2021, a major contemporary art survey exhibition organized by the Kochi Biennale Foundation. He was the recipient of the Pro Helvetia Art Writers Award for 2021, followed by a residency at the Atelier Mondial Basel, and published Lure of Collaboration, Dissecting Consensus for Take on Art, Premier Art Foundation's Arts Prize Award, including a residency at the Chateau de la Napoule in France. I will come to Anushka a bit later. Girish, Shahane, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar in the room with him as well, is an independent writer and curator. He has degrees in English literature from Elphinstone College, Bombay University, and Oxford University, which he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. He was editor and later consulting editor of Art India magazine. He's been a columnist for Time Out magazine, DNA newspaper, Young India, Scroll, In and Mid Lounge. He was director of the Scora Prize for Indian Contemporary Art from 2011 to 2014. And I see Neetu's come, and she was one of the recipients of that Scora Prize. Artistic director of Art Chennai 2014 and artistic director of India Art Fair 2015. Recent shows curated by him include Conjunction with the Spheres Delhi in September 2023, Magic Markers in October 2023, and Lucy House Anthology Mumbai, November 2023. Samira Bose is a curator and Asia art at the Asia Art Archive in Delhi, where she conceptualizes archival displays, develops discursive programs, and facilitates artist-led inquiries into the forms and structures of archives. Her recent projects generated in dialogue with colleagues include Still and Moving in Archive Time, a display of responsive works by Pallavi Arora at AAA in its office in New Delhi, 2024, 2 exhibition iterations of Mrinalini Mukherjee's archive, Mold the Wing to Match the Photograph, at CCG Library, AAA Hong Kong in 2023, and it's something which grows in all directions at Project Space Fika in 2022. Prior to these, she was involved in translations, expansions, AAA's presentation at Documenta 15, mobile library Nepal in Kathmandu from 2021 to 2022, and an ongoing talk series, Inter-Archives Conversations. Finally, to Anushka, who's on her way, and I'm just want to find maybe I should go slow so that we give her time to arrive. Anushka Rajendran is the curator of Premjish Art Foundation and also works independently as a curator and writer. Her ongoing curatorial research traces how the notion of public has acquired alternative significance to contemporary art in recent years, as well as the aesthetics of engagement within exhibition frameworks. She was the festival curator for Language is Migrant, the 2022 edition of Columbuscope, the only interdisciplinary arts festival in Sri Lanka, and was on the curatorial team for the Kochi Museums biennial. She's published essays in several publications, including anthologies, academic journals, and artist monographs, and is currently editing a monograph on Anoli Pereira's life and work. So with that, Premjish, I'm going to hand over to you for your opening remarks, and also you're going to be the timekeeper and keep us honest so that we finish the session on time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mira. Good morning, everyone. There's a rumor that's circulating that people are not attending any of the art events, walkthroughs, or anything related to art generally. Like there is this disillusion that is happening. But it's good to see, like you were saying, so many people, the crowd gathered today morning, even from 9:30 onwards to register and attend this event. And congratulations to you and the Anant Foundation team for conceptualizing this, organizing this, because like with I think the four of us, you can see the kind of expanse of curatorial practices that have been happening, but there's so little of discussions, space for discussions that's there in South Asia for the curatorial practice. And thank you for initiating this, conceptualizing this, and inviting all of us to be a part of this. So our panelists titled in conversation with institutional templates. And what we are trying to do is to engage with the multifaceted practices of all the speakers today, to also interrogate the curatorial methodologies they have developed for their own practice. And this does not mean that we are only looking at in isolation of their individual practice, but we will also try to juxtapose it with the historical lineage of the practice, the etymological lineage of the practice, which is about taking care, and the recent shift that is happening, which is instead of caring for the objects, but shifting to caring for caring of the subjects, or caring of the marginalized, oppressed subjects. That's an important shift that is happening throughout the world. So, but in all this, we are trying to understand the intricate interplay between the curator and the institution. And this is a relationship that's, as Anushka is here, serves as both a conduit for subversion and also collaboration with the broader socio-cultural. And at the heart of our discussion lies the dialectic interplay between this subversion and collaboration that defines the role of the curator right now. So we are examining various arenas, galleries, museums, foundations, institutions, also private foundations. And we're trying to analyze, as I said, the methodologies used by these curators to also understand how they are challenging normative beliefs, dominant beliefs, while also forming alliances with institutional partners. And by engaging in critical examination and thinking through theory, thinking with theory, and thinking against dominant theories also. So let's also shed light on the potential for change within the curator institutional dynamics. So I invite you, all of you, to present, start with your presentation. All of you have just 20 minutes, nothing more than that. So Anushka, would you like to start? Yeah.
Hi everyone. I'm so sorry for being late, Premjish, and the speakers, Samira, and the team. It was impossible to find an Uber. Many of us know each other, but I thought it would be good to kind of start with an introduction on some of the things that I do. I work at on many different projects at many different scales. But all of it, while the focuses can sometimes be varied, some of it really draws from my academic research on political and cultural trauma, especially between the 90s, during the 90s until to 2023, and trauma narratives in other parts of the world as well that I feel have solidarities that could be established with the South Asian region. But today I would like to zoom in on a part of my practice, which is articulated through Pramya Art Foundation, which is a non-for-profit established by Anahita Paneja and Shafali Somani around 7 years ago. And thinking about curatorial practice in an expanded sense, in a way that transcends exhibition making and also goes beyond the discursive turn to consider ethical infrastructures for the arts context in India and South Asia at large is one of our focuses. And as Premjish eloquently framed, the curatorial, the relationship between curators and institutions is something that also needs to be investigated. And we are all working towards meaningful change, ways of working in that acknowledges the labor that all of us as art workers and artistic practitioners put in, even if it is out of love, it needs to be acknowledged in ways that also fit with the materialities of practices and also be inclusive of critical dimensions that we may not always necessarily agree with. So through Pramya Foundation, we started with conversations. We spent a year before we officially launched, having conversations with artists, curators in various institutions around the world to try and understand what our mandate could be. And what we realized is that beyond the lack of not-for-profit institutions in our context, there is also limited access to support structures in the presence of limited funding from the state, which is also a good thing in some ways. But at the same time, we wanted to set in place support structures that were considered and planned with care and could acknowledge the various difficulties and challenges that artists and art workers, by extension, face on a day-to-day basis. And also, so set up to give a bit of context. Anahita and Shafali, they had been at that point of time running a commercial gallery in Delhi for about 10 years, and their desire to set up a not-for-profit came from the realization that there are projects and practices that they wanted to support that wouldn't necessarily make sense within the given agenda of a commercial art gallery, and they felt that a not-for-profit would be more suited, which is how they invited me to come on board and lead the programs for Pramya Foundation. So through the gallery, they had already initiated a program called the Arts Scribes Award, which acknowledged writers and researchers who wanted to explore curatorial narratives. Identifying at the time, this has been going on for about 10, 15 years at this point. So identifying at the time a dearth in discursive, research-oriented curatorial practices in India. So starting off from that was already a cue that we had in place to kind of further explore the programs that we wanted to do. And over time, our latest program, for instance, looks at is a moving image grant for which we reached out to the Hand Lefkins Foundation, realizing their interest in supporting moving image practices, and also thinking about what can institutions enable in a context where a lot of the art practices are the visibility of a lot of art practices are determined by market structure. As accommodating, as generous as it is in our context, it's still a market structure that very often renders certain practices visible and others invisible. So, and moving image in, except for a few exceptions, in an arts context where infrastructure is limited, the kind of support that is available is very less. So we reached out to them and we were able to form partnerships with international institutions, considering it is a South Asia project. And as far as possible, we do try to work in the region, and video also being something that can easily be transferred across complicated, complex borderlines, political borderlines. We felt that this is something that we could really work with. And given the nature of the region, we found it necessary to form partnerships globally with the Nottingham Contemporary, Ishar Art Foundation, Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo, MoCA in Antwerp, and also Backside in Hong Kong. And these partner institutions will commit to showing the work that emerges from a grant which is significant. It's a 15,000 euros grant. But at the same time, we don't expect the artists to put in the labor of writing proposals or submitting reports once the project is completed, submitting budgets, or it's a fixed grant that the artists may do whatever they want with as long as they produce one moving image work which can be shown in all these different contexts. So it sounds like a practical approach, which it is, but at the same time, it comes from an understanding and dialogue. It's through practice. We are trying to kind of also critique various methods of working that we usually take for granted, and when it comes to support structures such as this. And another point that I'd like to mention is that wherever possible, while we try to work with the South Asia region, we also try to we build global partnerships as well as a way to extend beyond the national framework, which can sometimes be limiting and insular, to also establish solidarities with contexts that might be relatable to the ways in which we work. Another project that is really special to us is Brand Publish. It took us several years to set this in motion. It was actually one of the first projects that we wanted to launch, but it took us close to 4 to 5 years to find the partnerships that were required to work on this. It is a publishing grant that covers research, artistic research to an extent, and has a fee, covers production, printing, design, copy editing, distribution. For artist publications that are not catalogs or monographs, but artists who work with the book format as part of their practice. And for this as well, we collaborate with regional partners, Vasil in Pakistan, Hita in Sri Lanka, Siddhartha's Foundation in Nepal, and Brito in Bangladesh, to identify, we work with these partners realizing that our knowledge of local context can sometimes be limited. So it was important to work with institutions that are closely in touch with artistic practices in the region locally, so that they also have an understanding of what practices are relevant for the context there. And through that, we have an open call across the region, and institutions first shortlist received applications, which will be then considered by a jury, and to kind of select that. Within our resources, as a small institution that is also nomadic, we don't have a physical space. We work in partnership with other venues for exhibitions and various other programs. So, given as much as we would like to open up a lot of these resources to as many people as possible, in the first phase of our life as an institution, we find it important to keep our programs as open and accessible as possible, but at the same time, we realize that it is limiting, that it is just one artist every edition that receives this opportunity. And then it's also important to us through this project to consider the publication not as a limited edition, but as an unlimited edition that can be printed and reprinted again. Also thinking about the book as an exhibition form, in ways that is not rooted, anchored to a site, but can travel to various contexts around the country and also globally and be available at local bookstores. So there is an unlimited print run, and that is something we are really interested in exploring, the possibility of publishing as something that can transcend the rootedness of an exhibition and access publics that may or may not be entirely aware of the work that we do as artists and curators and galleries. And the recipient of the first edition was Shahane. This enabled Sahil to realize a project that he had been trying to work on for a very long time at that point, which was based on the 2016 fire at the Natural History Museum and later at the Zoology Department of the Baliganj Science College. And these two fires also kind of revealed a lot of the limitations of public infrastructure around sustaining collections, that some of which are rare fossils and taxidermies, and so he traveled to these places and tried to kind of recreate the collection, whose archive had also burned down, through traces of public memory of the objects in the collection and speculating a narrative on the afterlives of these objects in the museum. This is already in production and we hope to launch this very soon. Yeah, so in addition to working on, as part of Craft Publish, it was also important for us to kind of extend the discourse around artist publications. One of the things we did was an Ask Me Anything session, read in style, but we kind of imagined, we asked participants, audiences to send their questions in advance. We received around 300 questions from practicing artists in South Asia on artist publications and how to work on them. And we had a panel that consisted of the Packet from Sri Lanka, Vidyan Sabhane from Delhi, and Fasal Rizvi from Karachi. And they addressed several of these questions as much as they could during those sessions. So it was an interactive conversation, dialogue format rather than a talks presentation series. And then we also curated a selection of artist publications, roughly from the post-independent period, that looked at narratives that had been marginalized by mainstream accounts or dominant accounts of certain histories. And those were also unlimited. And because some of them were out of print, they were meant to be unlimited editions and can still be reprinted, reproduced, circulated again. This was shown at Focal Point at the Shahjahan Foundation and later traveled to Delhi at the PTR. We've also worked on, we've also tried to organize workshops as much as we could, focused especially on artists who had just recently finished their MFA program in the city. Also realizing we never think about really, maybe some of us do, but for us, we realized that there is, it's almost emotional, but there is a period between graduating from art school and before starting your practice as a professional artist. There is a brief period of lag. It's almost like a jet lag in some ways. And we wanted to work with artists who were kind of rethinking their practice since art school, also unlearning certain structures that institutions can also sometimes introduce into an artist's practice. So we would kind of create like an informal group of people who would discuss and remain in conversation around certain overlaps within the focuses of their practice and try and rethink, talk about it, and arrive at proposals, which would culminate in not an exhibition, but a presentation of ideas that they would like to further develop. Another project that we have is Black Artist in Residence at the Cité International in Paris. And this especially looks at mid-career artists, especially mid-career artists who are rethinking or thinking through new directions within their practice, also realizing that the market structure often puts primacy on young emerging practices with the notion of discovery sometimes, and to kind of think beyond that, what happens to these young emerging practices later on in their careers, right? So we kind of again organize a residency. We don't expect an extensive proposal from the artists. We do not ask them for reports after the residency. We do not expect them to produce work either. This is just time for them to really think about their work, research further, connect with a larger global community of artists and art workers and art practitioners in Paris and explore new possibilities. And this is part of our interest in global exchange as well, because City International also has a very global community of artists. So it's not necessarily about Paris, but it's about encountering practices from around the world. The recipient of the first artist in residence was Hemant Srikumar. Many of them did have performances and exhibitions in Paris as well. We also commission works occasionally, usually related to sound. And at the India Art Fair, we try to work with practices that transcend materialities that are usually presented in an art fair context, also that realizing the publics that encounter works there and the large number of audiences that it receives, to kind of also expand the notion of what practice can be as represented by an art fair. And we worked with Subhani Suri on this wonderful project that brought together research that she had been working on for about 3 years at that point in time. And this was the first experiment with sculpture. It was a sonic sculpture that intervened with ghost tapes, with ghosts from the tapes from the linguistic archive of India. Another project, this was actually the first project that we formally opened Prameyan Foundation with, which was participatory. And this is a series of exhibitions that we have worked on so far that invites international practices, global practices that we feel are relevant to the local context towards pedagogic intent. And we conceptualize these exhibitions in a way that the artists arrive several weeks before the opening of the exhibition and engage with creative communities locally in Delhi, spend extensive time with them in conversation. Occasionally is also accompanied by a commission, which is developed in collaboration very often and in conversation with the city. Trying to kind of subvert the subvert exhibition structures where that ship works from one institution to another, and artists sometimes don't even know where their works are, and to really insist on understanding a context before exhibiting in it. And the focus of these projects are usually young emerging artists in the city whose notion of their own practice could potentially remain in conversation with these artists. The first artist we invited was Sue Williamson with her series Other Voices, Other Cities, which started in Havana when she collected statements from the local residents and in Havana and tried to arrive at a consensus, a statement that represented consensus among them. Several of it referred to the economic blockade that was going on at the time, and she wasn't allowed to put up these texts in public. So then she started exploring the subversive possibilities of propping up texts in public spaces for a brief moment in order to photograph them so that they do endure in public memory. So we brought that to Delhi in 2016, and she engaged with a group of young artists who couldn't necessarily fully agree with their own impressions of Delhi, which resulted in the work that emerged as well. We recently worked with Yoshinori Niwa, a project where he put up open calls around the city, offering money in exchange for the possessions, for the entire possessions of one person that he would choose. And we got calls from the community in around Lajpat Nagar Market, who arrived and spent hours, sometimes 2-3 hours, in conversation with the artist, and that was the intent of the project. We worked with Braha Ettinger during the pandemic. on a workshop that it was a platform for dialogue with young art historians, curators, and psychoanalysts based in Delhi, where they spent 6 weeks exchanging ideas around their practices. They were encouraged to keep a notebook in response to Graha's own note-making practices, and this emerged as a publication which we launched recently. The Artscribes Award I spoke about already, so I'll just quickly show some of the exhibitions that we worked on with addressing. I'm done anyway.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Just want to say that we will soon be working on Rajendran's exhibition, which will be really special to us. And it's especially in its reference to the vernacular. We look forward to more conversations around that. Thank you.
Typically, the understanding of a curator's role at an archive is about the activation of historical documents. While this is a part of my role and an exciting one, I wanted to take this panel and its title as an opportunity to somewhat sidestep that ambit and actually speak about 3 recent small-scale instances at our space: a display, a workshop, and a gathering that have pushed us to consider and confront the archival beyond the collections that we work with. These are attempts to think with artists about the forms, structures, and processes of archival work and its back and forth with the curatorial. This video playing here is a partial view of our Asiad Archive in India office space on a weekday in February. For those of you who may be unfamiliar, Asiad Archive in India is an independent not-for-profit dedicated to documenting and circulating materials on recent histories of art from the region. We are an overseas hub of Asiad Archive Hong Kong that started in 2000, and our office in India became active in 2013. Apart from making archival materials accessible online for free through digitization, we conduct research and do programs. For instance, as Meera had also mentioned in my bio, we most recently made exhibitions and did a series of programs around the archives of Rinaldi Mukherjee, Nilima Sheikh, K.G. Subramanian, and Jyoti Bhatt. 5 of us colleagues inhabit this office, and it is where the digitization takes place. In 2023, we also opened a small reading room, a kind of nook for visitors to browse and spend their time in. The archive office is typically characterized by quietness. Mostly there is the cyclical whirring of the scanner, punctuated by our chats as we wait for the materials to upload. However, in this recording, you can see that there's an animation that doesn't quite fit into the logic of the space. This is one of the 3 works that my colleague Pallavi Arora has made currently on display. As the display is on in our office till 1st April, I will not be giving too many details so as to entice you to visit before it closes. But I will use it to address what I have mentioned about an interest in the archival. Pallavi has been an archivist at Asiad Archive in India since 2018 and is a practicing artist interested in geometry, space, and organizational structures. For the last 5 years, we have sat on adjacent desks and had many discussions and cracked several jokes about our divergent experiences with the template of time. My role involves event-based activations with frequent deadlines, whereas Pallavi's experience of time is somewhat stretched. Her job is to digitize, annotate, and upload the archival materials, and this can take years at a time. The work you see here, placed within the reading room space, uses the moi pattern to express the illusion of time that Pallavi feels while working on the archive. She says that the moment she finishes working with one stack, another appears, and her navigation of multiple copies in archival collections blur linear timelines. This animation, which is rocking back and forth, which is moving but still, informs the title of our exhibition, Still and Moving in Archive Time, but also some of the other postulations that I will be sharing today. The second work is a series of drawings that we have installed across our desks and the scanning stations. This series responds to a structure in the archive where Pallavi feels she spends the majority of her time, the Excel sheet, the site of annotation and metadata. The series starts with a seemingly standard Excel sheet grid, which Pallavi has hand-drawn as well, and these are then layered with an altogether different image of the Excel, which dilates, shifts in dimensionality, warps. The final digitized archives appears in fairly neat grids. Everything seems to be organized. But Pallavi's own experience of organizing materials is much more complicated. The Excel sheet wavers as she fills rows and rows that do not fit in the standard desktop. On some days, she feels the Excel sheet will consume or eat her up. On other days, she spends time in just filling out one cell, trying to figure out undecipherable scrawls. And working with materials from decades ago, she feels that the Excel sheets can feel like a time portal. The third work is also a stop motion animation, and it was a chance for us to face our storeroom. The storeroom is a source of anxiety for us at the archive. Speaking of institutional templates, the storeroom is a standard presence for art spaces, but for us as a digital archive, the storeroom is where we keep the boxes that we are working on and that we borrowed. In some ways, it is like our to-do list, a space that holds all our backlog. We thought that Pallavi's work at the back end with all that backlog may be a good way for us to confront this room of anxiety, and so the third work is placed there. Here are some screenshots from the animation, which plays with the idea that time is organized in standard grids. You see what appears to be a calendar, but with no month or year clarified, and slowly the dates are layered and become denser to the point where you cannot see them. This work also has an anecdote behind it. I once, excitedly, offered to print year calendars for the team. All my colleagues are researchers and archivists, and they refused. They refuse because for months on end, their tasks remain similar as they work through one collection. And unless I'm printing a 5-year calendar, they weren't interested. This animation is an expression of Pallavi's, but also an archivist's refusal towards the standard calendar, and instead offers us a calendar of archive time. Pallavi responds in the display not to the materials in the archive, the photographs, manuscripts, sketches, and notes, but to the effects of processing the archive and how that leads to a shift in the perspective of time. This display was a way for us to think about the curatorial as a long and ongoing conversation between colleagues during their work hours at an archive. And for the purpose of this display, we took on the roles of artist and curator. Our pinboards and office ephemera have been replaced by Pallavi's work, and it almost feels as if the archive and its everyday apparatus are annotated by artistic practice. And we are still considering how and whether these may shape our relationship anew, not only to our storeroom, but to the archive itself. Just 2 weeks ago, Pallavi's animations and drawings overlooked animated chatter in our space over a 2-day workshop led by Savani Suri. Savani surfaces again. Savani Suri is an artist, writer, curator who thinks with and around sound. Last year, she published an essay that is available online and in print titled The Search for Hasena's Song and Other Phenophonies, which are responses to her time in the digitized recordings of the Linguistic Survey of India, but also propositions she makes as she pursues the murmurs, crackles, and excesses that make their way into recordings led by a colonial state apparatus. Discussions around Savani's essay led us to conceive of something, this is the exact email title, and our space. And after a long back and forth, we thought of a 2-day workshop which would investigate the idea of corruption as a methodological and conceptual device to guide participants to enter into and work through archival material. Savani wrote as a note for the workshop, if one were to tune into the resonant nooks and crannies, crackles and grooves, dust and silverfish, holes and leaks in physical and digital artifacts, what new forms of indexicality would they activate? How can speculative listening, fictioning, and short-circuiting be brought in as a set of orientating instruments to make one's way through the spatiality and duration of an archive? When points, nodes, and surfaces that don't usually touch cross with one another, what new ways of knowing and reading can be mobilized? The workshop hosted 12 participants, and it was a motley but interesting group. We had an archaeologist, a historian of science studying herbarium typologies, an ethnomusicologist, a photographer who inhabits the archive of the newsroom, and artists and researchers working with or around archives, particularly around personal collections. Initially, there was heated discussion around what's at stake for all these practitioners working with archives, within or without institutions. We learned about the varied imaginations of an archive for this group, and it expressed clearly the charge around the field of archiving, which has been around for some time, but it seems to have become even more intense. And rather than moving towards specificity, the term archive swiveled and swerved and bounced around within the archive office. In terms of the structure, apart from moderated discussions, the workshop hosted a presentation by Savani and an invitation to filmmaker Priyanka Chabra to share on her film Ikrar Nama, which uses state documents in her family archive to probe the history of partition and how partition migration shaped the architecture of her neighborhood in West Delhi. To think around corruption in an archive is a provocation by Savani, as institutional archives are highly selective about what materials match archival standards, and she pays attention to the excesses that are out of the control of the archivist. For us too, this is a provocation that we need to contend with, especially as in the last few months, we have been confronted with moisture-laden 35 mm slides from a humid port city. If the archive itself cannot accommodate the unclear image, how and where can the curatorial step in? I will leave this hanging, and for the sake of brevity, I want to raise and highlight one perspective offered by a participant in the workshop, Mayank Agarwal, who is currently an archivist at Sarai CSDS and who is also here. As an interpretation of corruption, Mayank stated, to corrupt has the Latin etymology of core, which means altogether, and rompere, which is to break. It's the same root word for rupture. Corrupting is basically an act of rupturing altogether. But isn't an archive at its root itself corrupt? Isn't it merely a collection of ruptures of the past? As a quick and lazy ChatGPT search shows, it also shares the root with abrupt, interrupt, erupt, among others. I will ignore bankrupt for now, though it hits a nerve for a digital archive in this economy. In an essay we read together for the workshop by historian Arlit Faj, she writes that the archival document is a tear in the fabric of time. The discussions at the workshop made me think about how the curatorial can facilitate ruptures, interruptions, or eruptions in the seemingly quiet everyday of the archive office. Critical conversations, and these can look like critical conversations between colleagues about what they're working on, drawings that express the angst of the archivist, and a two-day interaction that insists on the potential of fictioning to circumvent the laments around the corrupted archival document. Another very welcome rupture, interruption, disruption to the archive was by First Draft. First Draft is composed of a group of artist friends who have led a series of what they call slow gatherings across Delhi and elsewhere since 2018 as a way to recover what they call the transmission of intimacy, especially offline, post-pandemic. We have Girish and Priyank here from First Draft. They have gathered on residential rooftops in non-commercial organization spaces, taken walks, eaten together. In August 2023, they extended an invitation to Asian Archive in India to host, or rather co-host, a First Draft session. They came in to plan the gathering, and we had a long chat one afternoon, and they responded to a display we had on then in our reading room. The display over here was titled Under the Influence. It had been led by a team in Hong Kong who in 2015 had asked 100 artists from across Asia to share one book that deeply inspired their practice and to also send us a note or a story for the selection. And that story then served as the library card. The project traveled to us in 2022 and had a number of activations. With First Draft specifically, we plan to host a session where participants who signed up shared one page from any kind of text that deeply influenced them. However, instead of the participant reflecting on their own page, which is straightforward enough, we shuffled the pages so that in the gathering, one would discuss their annotations or denotations of an anonymous other's page. We were a group of 18 who interacted for more than 5 hours in the archive. For me, this gathering led to some thinking about the core of archival practice, finding one page which holds deep meaning for someone else and inscribing it for circulation, or the back and forth that takes place between the intention of the maker-keeper and how it is read by the reader. The most exciting part of the gathering was how the perusal of such a document happened not in isolation, but in conversation. My colleagues and I admire First Draft's ability to inhabit a space, to really sit for a while, and at the same time keep moving. While this gathering and other interruptions and ruptures in the archive office are temporary, the charge of these ensure that afterwards it will never quite be the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Girish. Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Anushka. And I'm sure there's there will be a lot of questions now, and I'll take my time to start with the general opening question to all of you, which is generally related to what I shared with Anushka also about the administrative aspect of it, the negotiation of it, which is basically preserving the curatorial autonomy, or in your case, institutional autonomy too. Samira, because I know that AAA has an immense collection of archives, but some of this also comes from influential families and artists and all. So, how do you negotiate, and how do you align with also the philanthropic impulse behind the foundations, exhibitions, institutions, gestures of contribution, and archives and everything? But how do you maintain the curatorial autonomy, or what is the struggle in maintaining that? And what new ways you insert your Trojan horses and or you create insurgencies in that is what I would like to know from all of you.
I think you can put your mics on.
Thank you, Premjish, for that question. While I hear you, and yes, it is important to be assertive, but I feel that we also don't give enough credit to how incidental curatorial practices sometimes can be. If you think about practice as something that is malleable, rather than something that is fixed, rather than an arrow that is fixed in its direction, if we think of it as dialoguing with institutional limitations and threats to autonomy in terms of creative directions that one would like to pursue. I'm not endorsing any restrictions on curatorial autonomy, but at the same time, I do insist that, one would find oneself in interesting places. For instance, just to kind of speak from my practice, during the pandemic, there was a surplus of online exhibitions, which made me slightly uncomfortable because the interfaces, the aesthetic of the interface is very often resembled or use technologies from online shopping websites or aesthetically reflected Instagram, big tech infrastructures, which politically doesn't always align with a lot of the artworks that were being shown in these spaces. So then I turned to, and at the same time I was tasked with, as part of the curatorial team for the Asian Art Biennial, I was tasked with finding a digital online home for the moving image works from the exhibition. And then I turned to CAMP because they had been working with Padma for decades at that point, thinking about alternative infrastructures, and worked very closely with them to think of something that was discursive, annotated, and completely marked a radical departure from the aesthetics of interfaces. So it's not always about, sometimes discomfort can be generative and produce new meanings as well.
So this negotiation and navigation is, of course, a part of working in an archive. And since 2000, I've been engaged in archive in Hong Kong, but also in India. We're constantly, even with internally brainstorming, thinking about what are the sources of funding and what would it mean for us to get funding from certain places, etc. But I actually want to answer your question from the curatorial rather than from what the archives we select, etc. In office, we often have a debate about the posthumous archive. I mean, when the artist is still alive, the artist whose archive we worked on, there's always a conversation happening. But often what happens with the posthumous archive, that it is you're either you're either in conversation with the estate or with the family, etc. And the other thing is about artist intentionality or what they might have wanted you to do or what they might have said versus say what you want to do as an archive, what stakes or propositions you want to make in the public domain that perhaps the artist might not have intended. And it's that tension that we really try to work on, that we really try to explore. And it's complicated, especially when you put out exhibitions and with those who knew the artist very well, who would say that I don't think this is what the artist was saying. But since we digitize and circulate materials for free, we're interested in the dialogue that happens when these go beyond not only the control of perhaps the estate, but also beyond our control, and that they're constantly sort of redefined. Yeah.
Yes, what I'd say is, and this goes back to the idea of the template, and the templates, if they exist, are very broad indeed. And so really it's an individual discovery with every single project and is unpredictable in a number of ways. So there's really no formula or, even in interacting with the government, as the kind of saying, because depending on who's in charge and what their attitude is, you can be given a fair amount of freedom or very little and a lot of interference.
Also, in terms of the various exhibitions Girish did, that also dealt with memory, memorialization, homespun, and all which we are talking about. That also addressed historical traumas, especially also from places of conflict and violence, oppression, and everything. How do you, again, address issues of contested narratives and space out art and artists in such a way that given narratives, less of a non-narratives, could emerge? And you gave a very important and a beautiful example of the unsettling and asking for tea, which you mentioned. But will you tell us more about it?
And again, I don't really blame him. He's not in contemporary art. He doesn't really get it, and he has a particular perspective. But generally, and there's a personal preference, I prefer not to foreground the political too much. And that work by Anita I showed, which I had a little conversation, I don't know if you remember, Gayatri, about it with you and the placement of it. Because it has a very political look. And yet it's placed in this kind of crazy, zany kind of space, which has a different mode. But I just feel that if the politics of it is actually not that difficult to get if you see what the work is. And I trust the viewers who come to the Navy Art Foundation to get that politics. So even within a certain mood you're creating, there are kind of works that are taking you in different moods from there. And whereas if I point to it and say, look, that kind of defines the mood a bit too much. And so I prefer to work that way, but that's just my own personal preference.
Yeah. So, Samira, before you show us that slide of about rupture, I had just written that word rupture, but I also wrote down another word, preserve. And I think it's very important to address these two words because I'll come to that. And if you look at the role of traditional archives and the way they were playing out in preserving certain narratives by also obliterating and marginalizing the other narratives. In that context, rupture also comes from the side of social justice. And I feel fundamentally archives still try to preserve. And the side of social justice, the side of speaking on behalf of the oppressed, always comes to haunt as a spectre. And I also wanted to introduce this binary of Vijay and Rapture. What do you think?
So one of the things that I also wanted to highlight when I was saying this idea of there's a charge in the field of archiving, not only within that workshop and within our space, but generally in the field. And I think that there's a lot of different forms and formats of archives. For example, in South Asia alone, we're seeing that the archives that are coming up are not of the capital A archive institutional structures that are perhaps in the West or global north, or what you would call it, but that are actually using techniques of circulation that are perhaps from where they are. It's not always lamenting about lack of infrastructure to properly preserve the documents, but innovating ways in which you can actually continue to circulate material without, say, perhaps traditionally preserving them. And I think one of the ways that Asia Archive also does it is this idea of preservation through circulation. But one of the things that came up in Silvani's workshop, I also read it out, this idea of silverfish. It comes from a book that's just come out. It's called Mass Traffic, with that Sabi Ahmed and Namkyan Z have authored together. And they've written very interestingly about rather than thinking of preservation, for example, there's this anxiety about silverfish eating the paper. And what Lantian says is that actually the silverfish is metabolizing the paper in a certain way that it has its own life. And I know this is very provocative as someone who's in the archive and saying this, and it's complicated. I think archives will take some time to catch up to that idea. But I think it's pushing us to think that materials have lives far beyond preservation. And that perhaps we also need to think beyond a simple logic of preservation and think of more ways around it.
Anushka, you were talking about grant in one of your slides. You were from grants and grants that enable the artist. And this is not a question related to craft, but as a curator who have also brought in different parts of the world, and who also has a very analytical, critical outlook towards the various things, and also as an observer. Like, what are these grants enabling? Are they enabling the artist to be aligned with the philanthropic vision or the foundation particular vision of artistic growth? Or are they making any kind of difference?
I really appreciate that question. Thank you. This is a very subjective opinion, but I feel that there is no such thing as unconditional funding support, and it's about navigating various structures. So, as a curator working with an institution, there are various ways in which I negotiate that. In terms of, for instance, one of the things that we are very clear about at Premier Foundation is that we don't want to be a collection-based institution ever. So not working with collections then liberates us from certain unconscious even biases that could perhaps come into place. And then, so there are various ways in which we kind of negotiate this, right? I mean, public funding has its advantages in terms of what it can enable because it is removed from, again, the focus on collections, but at the same time, it could bring in other forms of constraints on what can be said and what can't be said. So there are various ways in which we kind of actively think through this from project to project, and also through the partnerships that we build. For instance, India can sometimes be the more dominant voice within the South Asian region. So it was really important for us to partner with India and with and Russell and to somehow be involved in conversations that relate to the context that they work so closely with. So there are various ways in it. It's usually ad hoc, project to project, and yeah. And in terms of enabling, I try not to use the word enable and opportunity as much as possible, but I realized it came up once or twice when I was speaking because, yeah. But at the same time, we look at it as, especially in a context where there are wonderful institutions, but the arts context is dominated by a market structure, we do emphasize as much as possible supporting practices that are non-material, that do not receive attention.
Yeah, please, from the audience, please. Any questions? Please be brief. Rahab, yes.
No, just I wanted to share because while we were and this is for Anushka also, when we were curating Kochi, we were working with the Sunijana archive. And it's so interesting that in the Sunijana archive, there's lots of images of young tribal women without anything on top, right? So we took a decision not to include many of them. So this is the interesting thing, that when you're working with archives, you are doing many things. Like you're creating your own, not fictions, but you're curating basically. And from your perspective, from your political position, from whatever, but you eliminate things, you take things. So this is a direct example of what one does with archives. And also just responding to Girish, that even in the work that you showed, see, the political also is very interesting, that even if you're directly political, the humor that is involved is also a very interesting. I mean, I use it as a device because I think you can do a lot with having content, but if you have humor alongside that, it gives the option of not putting something down people's throat. That there's a breathing space where you can also have laugh while you understand what's going on. So just sharing these.
If I may just, thanks a lot for that. And I agree. And in fact, in the placement of those, Ali Raza's Throne and ready-made, I guess, by Nicolas Vasula, all of them had that kind of humor, but they were also, even Nicolas' work does tackle caste and gender issues with the broom, etc. So yeah, I totally did. I thought that it was more effective to do it that way, but there was some disagreement, and so I thought I would put that.
Yeah. Because it's homespun, you definitely remember that my proposal was not accepted.
So you'll never forgive me for that.
No, it's not that. It was because it became a part of my practice, and I often show that slide in clothing. So when I was invited for the show to create a room, at that time I was very much working on this MOU, Wisdom of Non-Belongings, which was quite an exciting project. But Anupam was a very close friend, and personally knowing him and their collection, I wanted to create a kind of narrative between non-collection. So to complicate and complement that other 8 rooms, which one was mine, I proposed a room with nothing, but finally it didn't materialize, except whenever I show my presentation, I show this as a. So I then wrote a very emotional mail to Girish saying that the curatorial refusal of not giving me a room which will have nothing is actually an acceptance that existed. So,
Sorry, can I just come in?
Well, yeah. Rahab was waiting.
Can I respond to Anita? I just want
Yeah.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah. I think that's an interesting example you brought up, Anita, and I actually remember that, and it was the first site really where I was thinking about archives. But I mean, the idea not to show those at the Kochi Biennale is a sensitive decision, but I'm also interested in thinking about now those images were taken. How is it that, I mean, not showing them is one thing, but how is it that we can have conversations about the discomfort that we feel? How much has changed in discourse that those images are now something that we can't even really look at, that we find disrespectful? So I think that dialogue about that discomfort is something that we at the archive are really thinking about. Yeah.
Oh, I'm happy, Nancy, if you'd like to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, because it's connected with
Sure.
what Anita and Samira said. So, like Samira, I was also a viewer at the KMB, and I really enjoyed the fact that we decided not to show those images because those images objectify the woman's body, especially the Adivasi woman's body. And
it's interesting because on one hand, while communist politics valorizes workers' rights, it was completely retrogressive when it came to gender issues. But again, I also respond to what Samira is saying, that if you're not going to show those images, then how do you generate a conversation around it? For what? So there's a form. There are different forms of self-censorship that we actually saw around this panel, and I really enjoyed that. The questions of complicity, but also forms of resistance against different kinds of institutional templates. So I enjoyed all three conversations. I especially enjoyed Samira's conversation, which was very poetic and philosophically rich. And I enjoy the fact that you took us through slow time into this the affective role of the archivist, the everyday rituals of archiving. And while I enjoyed all of that, I just would like to introduce a caveat, a cautionary tale. Sometimes I feel that while we are using poetic forms of interfacing with the archive and archival fragments, sometimes when it comes to singular artists' archives, what happens is that we start fetishizing and valorizing every fragment from the archival collection. And what that does is that we end up then valorizing the artist's intention, the intentionality. So that can also become a fantasy. And then we're not able to look at all the other larger questions. So so my question is that it's a dilemma. How do we actually balance between the discursive and the affective in our interface with the archives?
I agree with you, absolutely. And I think that when the presentation or the three instances that I showed were actually not around our historical archival collections. But when we work on those, we actually do it very, very differently. And we think very much about how our work, especially as an archive, you actually have some power about how these materials are circulating. So how do we not fetishize? How do we not canonize? And again, not go into sort of nostalgia when we're presenting them.
The artist's intention, which then can also become, because then you're not looking at all the other forms of art criticism, art history, cultural theory, political history, many other things which then come into framing, contextualizing those archives.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the things, for example, the recent exhibitions that we did with Mrinalini Mukherjee's archive, which was actually happened at FICA and also recently closed in our library in Hong Kong. One of the things that we did is we actually foregrounded the archivist experience of the materials. So, for example, we showed a lot of, especially in the FICA exhibition, we couldn't get an artwork, Mrinalini Mukherjee's artwork. So we showed 35 slides of this large-scale body of work, and what that encounter for Pallavi actually as an archivist work was. So how can we think about shifts in scale of perception? So those are also sort of things that we're thinking about, but also not accepting and assuming Mrinalini Mukherjee's instructions as the only ones, but putting it in critical dialogue with also what's happening in the field today. So those are attempts that we make, and you're right, it's a dilemma, and it's something we have to continue to do, and not only do within ourselves, but also people who come into the archive with a great sense of nostalgia. We often have to be like the critical voice coming in as well.
Thank you.
And last question, because then we break for tea in the interest of time, and then you can continue the dialogue with tea, whoever. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. So it was really enriching to hear that sort of historical trajectory, a little bit about your practices. But I was interested in where you would like to leave your discourses for, or in the future. So could you reflect a little bit about what's forthcoming for you? Because I realized that, Girish, even with your presentation and when you talked about the NGMA, I would love to see, and I told you in your camaraderie of how things were panning out while Rajiv was there, but look at the legacy of what it is now. It didn't seem to have a snowball effect in the way that one imagined it would. And of course, with the sense of the archive, one also thinks or imagines deviance and dissonance as important, apart from Russia. So how would you like to see your practices, curatorial and also sort of direction-giving practices transform forthcoming? having given a sense of where they are now, or what you'd like to articulate.
The way I like to. Thank you for that wonderful question. The way I like to think of it is that our roles are incremental as much as possible. So it's not about necessarily working with an end goal in sight, because sometimes then the direction can also be singular. I feel that the process is also meandering, putting out fires as you see along the way, and slow, sustained, and intergenerational is how I'm going to make it.
In a way, I mean, the practical answer is whatever comes one's way. But I have recently been, for a lot of years, I was kind of confused about the state, because art historically is very clear, modernism, postmodernism, one kind of knew the ropes pretty well, let's say. And then what is happening in the last few years has been a bit confusing for me. And over the last year, I finally kind of, to my satisfaction, figured it out. And Anushka was, in fact, at Trivandrum, where I gave this initial lecture about what I call paramodernism. And so right now, I'm interested in just talking more and maybe even curating stuff related to this concept. So yeah, it's a very practical kind of.
That's a really good question, Rahab. I'm going to think about it more. But for now, I think what I'm really interested in doing, if I just have to share three, one would be, of course, paying attention to critical thinking that is happening in the archival field, not here, but internationally. I'm interested in pushing the dynamism of an archive office. Sort of like I've shown, we don't actually have a separate project space, display space, and we have to constantly move things around. And I'm also actually disrupting my colleagues' everyday work when I do these programs. So I'm interested in pushing and thinking about dynamism in the archive office. And the third is that I'm actually really interested in thinking with artists, not only about the archive, the form, structures, and processes of archive, but the curatorial, because I think the artists, and even in Delhi alone, we can see that artists are thinking with the curatorial in really interesting ways. So I want to think with them.
Thank you.
Can I say something? It's just triggered with all this conversation has triggered something. I'm remembering a wonderful show curated by Opie in Weezer called A Short Century, which I saw some years ago, more than a decade ago, in which he placed works of art in the context of other material, social material. For example, clips from newspapers, in the sense that generally creating a total context in which a work of art could be understood, read, interpreted, etc., etc. And actually, that's like the curation itself as an archive. And I'm just putting this forward because it's just triggered, and it's a way to look at the archive, like when you're looking at Mrinali Mukherjee, to contextualize it in a full fashion through newspapers, through the current events, through fiction that was produced, through writing, through film, and so when a whole archive around in a certain time can be produced, that gives a different. I remember it as an amazing experience. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, speaker.